The Caldrith Compact had conquered 81 worlds by choosing to land during each planet's worst season. Because a species that could stand in the hottest hour of the day without breaking was a species that had already won the argument before it started. And on a record afternoon in July, with the pavement in Compton hot enough to warp a shoe sole, an invasion fleet came down 2 blocks off Compton Boulevard expecting exactly that kind of surrender. What they found instead was a block party still running, hydrants still open, dominoes still slapping down on a folding table under a pop-up canopy, like the sky opening up and dropping alien soldiers into the middle of everybody's Saturday was somebody else's emergency to deal with. Nobody up in orbit thought a single city block mattered enough to send more than a courtesy patrol. That was the mistake. Before we get into it, if this is your first time here, I'm running this channel solo out of my apartment, so a like and a subscribe genuinely helps us climb toward our first 1,000, and it costs you nothing. Drop a comment for me if the toughest, most heat-adapted species in the galaxy landed in your neighborhood in the middle of a heat wave. What's the one everyday thing about where you live that would actually end up being the problem for them? I read every single one. Now let's go stand on that block with everybody else. Overmarshal Vase Sorrent had led the Caldrith Compact's 4th expansion column across 81 worlds, and every campaign had ended the same way. Within a single planetary rotation of landing in whatever season broke a world's population fastest, deep winter, monsoon, drought, the locals folded, because nothing tested a species like an environment their own bodies couldn't out-argue. It wasn't cruelty. It was doctrine, and it had a name every Caldrith cadet learned before their first deployment. The species that outlasts the furnace already owns the field. The Caldrith themselves had evolved on a world with a surface temperature that would cook most life on sight, and their soldiers could stand bare-skinned in heat that killed unprotected humans in minutes. Sorrent trusted that doctrine the way a man trusts a bridge he's crossed 81 times without it once giving out under him. Ensign Ilya Korat did not share that confidence, and she had earned a quiet reputation, over 3 tours under Sorrent's command, for reading every page of the environmental and infrastructure surveys instead of the 2-paragraph summary the general staff preferred. Overmarshal, the target region's power distribution isn't centralized the way the last 4 capitals were. There are localized load-shedding rotations built into the civilian grid, sections cut on a rolling schedule during extreme heat events, on purpose, before the whole system fails. And there's a water pressure pattern in the residential blocks that spikes and drops on no schedule I can model. Then their infrastructure is fragile, Ensign. That supports the doctrine, it doesn't contradict it. I don't think it's fragile, sir. I think it's built to bend on purpose so it doesn't break. That's different. Sorrent considered this the way he considered most of Korat's objections, carefully, respectfully, and ultimately within the framework that had never once failed him. Every world we've taken had systems built to bend, Ensign. Bending stops mattering once the population sees us stand in the heat that's already bending them. Prepare the ground team. Let's introduce ourselves to their hottest afternoon. At 6 that morning, 4 hours before the Caldrith Compact's ground team ever set foot on Compton soil, Odell Marsh was already standing on a rooftop off Willowbrook Avenue with a multimeter in one hand and a bag of tools slung over his shoulder, because Mrs. Alvarez's window unit had started tripping her breaker every time the compressor kicked on. And July in Compton wasn't the kind of month you let a broken AC wait until Monday. Odell was 33 years into fixing window units, central air old apartment building electrical panels, and every ancient appliance in a 6-block radius that nobody else wanted to touch, ever since he'd apprenticed under his uncle at 15 sweeping out the shop. He wasn't flashy about it. He just knew, better than almost anybody in the neighborhood, exactly how much heat a piece of machinery could take before it quit on you, and exactly how to keep it running past that point anyway. Everything's got a breaking point once it gets hot enough, Odell said, mostly to himself, the way he said it on nearly every job before he ever touched a wire. Question's just where it is and whether you're ready for it. He found the short, fixed it, and moved to the next call on his list. Compton in a heat wave ran on its own particular logic. The city's power grid, aging in the older residential blocks, was set up to shed load on a rolling schedule, the utility comp. And he posted every summer certain streets losing power for 20-minute windows in careful rotation, on purpose, so the whole system didn't collapse under every air conditioner running at once. The asphalt on the wide residential streets soaked up sun all day and radiated it back well past sundown, turning some blocks into slow ovens that stayed 10 degrees hotter than the forecast long after the sun went down. Every summer, without fail, somebody on Odell's route cracked open a fire hydrant to cool the block down, which the city officially discouraged and unofficially tolerated because it dropped water pressure across whole sections of pipe for hours at a stretch. The old apartment buildings ran their electrical panels close to their rated limit the second every window unit came on at once, panels that Odell had rewired more times than he could count. And on the corner of two of the hottest blocks sat Renata Boyce's Market, which had run a backup generator and sold more bags of ice in July than the rest of the year combined. Because Renata had learned decades ago that a heat wave without power was the one emergency her whole neighborhood actually planned for. None of it looked like a weapon. All of it was about to behave like one. The Caldrith ground team came down at mid-morning, in full environmental armor built to shed heat generated by their own bodies during hard exertion, armor that ran cooling loops through small onboard reservoirs, meant to be topped off periodically from whatever water source was nearest. Because on 81 prior worlds, water had never once been a resource anybody bothered rationing against an invading force. 2 scout units assigned to map the block's utility lines lost their sensor calibration within the hour, not from sabotage, but because the asphalt heat radiating off Compton Boulevard by 11 a.m. sat well past anything their thermal instruments had been tuned to read as background environment, rather than active heat source requiring evasive response. They spent 40 minutes flagging empty sidewalks as hostile thermal signatures before Corette pulled them back for recalibration. Mistake count 1, though nobody up in orbit had a category small enough to log it yet. By noon, a soldier assigned to secure the block's water main, standard procedure, on the theory that controlling water controlled a population, found a fire hydrant already cracked open by 3 kids cooling off in the spray, one of them holding a flattened tin can against the nozzle to fan the water out wide across the street. The soldier ordered them to disperse. The oldest of the 3, a boy of about 11, looked at him with the specific unbothered patience of a kid who had been told to move along by adults his whole life and had never once found it urgent. "Man, it's 106 degrees. Ain't nobody moving." He kept the can pressed against the nozzle. The soldier, whose translation unit had no framework for a threat that simply declined to be a threat, radioed it in as unresolved and moved on to the next block, where the exact same thing happened again. Farther down the same block, an older man everybody called Pop Freeman was doing what he did every scorching afternoon that summer, which was sitting on a folding chair outside his garage with a box fan angled at a bucket of ice water, running a spare extension cord out to a neighbor's porch because his own line had tripped twice already that week. A Caldrith patrol passing by paused to scan the setup, unsure whether it constituted a power diversion worth reporting. Pop didn't even look up from his newspaper. "Y'all want to sit a minute, there's room," he said. "Heat like this, don't nobody get anywhere fast anyhow." Nobody sat. The patrol logged the encounter as inconclusive and moved on, which was, by that point in the afternoon, becoming something of a pattern in every report reaching the command shuttle. That afternoon, Compton's utility company ran its scheduled load-shedding rotation exactly as it did on every heat advisory day that summer, cutting power to a handful of residential blocks for 20-minute windows, cycling through in order to keep the wider grid from buckling. Nobody had announced this to the Caldrith ground team, because nobody in Compton thought it was information an invading force would need, the same way nobody posts a bus schedule for people who aren't planning to ride the bus. When the block containing the team's forward staging point lost power right on schedule, 3 Caldrith soldiers standing near an open utility panel tapped quietly into the grid that morning to top off their armor's cooling reservoirs rather than draw down their own limited water stores, found their cooling loops running dry mid-cycle, with no warning, in the hottest stretch of the afternoon. It wasn't an attack. It was Tuesday's rotation, the same as it had been every Tuesday that summer. Over Marshal Sarrant, reviewing the incident, T from the command shuttle filed it as a minor infrastructure inconvenience and ordered the team to draw directly from the nearest open water source instead, which was, on the map his staff pulled, a fire hydrant 3 blocks over. The same hydrant the 3 kids had cracked open that morning, and which half the block had since gathered around with lawn chairs, a cooler, and somebody's portable speaker. Because that was what an open hydrant on a 106-degree day turned into in about 4 hours flat. "You can't be tapping that," said a man named Curtis Downey, who ran the block association and had, over the years, developed a very specific, very calm authority about matters concerning his own street. "City already dropped our pressure enough with the rotation. You draw more off that main, my whole block's got nothing left for anybody's AC tonight, and half these window units are already running hot as it is. This resource is required for essential equipment cooling," said the soldier assigned to the hydrant. "In the flat, clipped register Caldrith field units used for anything approaching a directive." "So's mine," Curtis said, not moving. "You want to argue about whose equipment's more essential, we can do that, but I promise you it ends with everybody on this block a lot more irritated with you than they already are, and right now they're not irritated at all. That's about to change." The soldier had no doctrine entry for a civilian calmly negotiating water rights during an active occupation, and reported the standoff up the chain rather than resolve it, which meant, for nearly 2 hours, an entire Caldrith cooling detail sat idle at a hydrant, while a block association meeting that had started about trash pickup schedules quietly absorbed an alien resource dispute into its agenda without missing a beat. By late afternoon, a city utility inspector named Andre Suggs arrived to check the block's meters after a resident called in a complaint about unauthorized tapping of a main line. A routine call for Andre, who had worked Department of Water and Power inspections in Compton for 19 years, and had in that time developed absolutely no patience for anyone, human or otherwise, who touched city infrastructure without a permit. "This connection's not authorized," Andre said, clipboard already out, looking at the jury-rigged tap the Caldrith team had run into the grid that morning. "I need to see a work order, a DWP authorization number, and proof of insurance before this stays live another minute, or I'm shutting it down myself." "We do not operate under your civil authority," said the officer accompanying the inspection. "Don't matter whose authority you operate under, matters whose pipe you're drawing off, and this one's the city's, and the city says you need paperwork." Andre wrote something on his clipboard without looking up. "I'll be back in an hour. Have the paperwork or don't have the tap." He left. The tap stayed illegal. Nobody in the Caldrith chain of command had any idea how to generate a City of Compton DWP work order, and asking their own logistics division to fabricate municipal paperwork for a species they hadn't formally contacted, yet turned out to be a bureaucratic problem no war college had ever prepared them for. By evening, with the day's heat finally starting to break, Renata Boyce's corner store had become the only reliably cool, reliably powered building on either block, running steady on her backup generator, while half the neighborhood's window units groaned through the tail end of the day's load-shedding cycle. A Caldrith logistics officer, sent to assess local resources for potential requisition, walked in expecting to find some kind of civic authority to negotiate with, and instead found Renata restocking a cooler of bagged ice, while 3 of her regular customers argued good-naturedly about a domino game at the counter. "I require access to your cooling and power infrastructure," the officer said. "You require $2 for that bag of ice, same as everybody else in here today," Renata said, not looking up from the cooler. "Generator's mine. Ran on my own dime since before you people showed up, and it'll keep running after you leave, however that goes. You want ice, that's $2. You want the generator, that's a conversation you're not gonna win, so I'd stick with the ice." The officer stood there long enough that the domino game paused briefly to watch, decided there was nothing further to negotiate, and left with nothing, which Renata noted in her nightly register total as simply one alien customer declined to purchase. Overmarshal Sarrant received the day's compiled reports that night: a stalled water negotiation, an impounded utility tap, 3 soldiers with degraded cooling reserves, 2 recalibrated scout drones, an inconclusive porch encounter, and a general assessment that no civilian authority on the block had yet acknowledged Caldrith jurisdictio. And over anything, and read them the way Ilya Korat always read reports in full without skipping to the summary for the first time in his career. What struck him wasn't any single failure. It was that nothing on the list resembled resistance. Nobody had raised a weapon. Nobody had organized a counterattack. The block had simply kept doing exactly what it always did on the hottest day of the year, and every one of those ordinary routines had, without any coordination at all, quietly ground his operation to a stop. "Overmarshal," Korat said, watching him read, I don't think their strength is built to survive the heat. I think it's built to survive the heat without anyone having to stop living their life to do it. That's not the same test we prepared for. Sorrent did not answer immediately. For the first time in 81 campaigns, he found himself without a clean rebuttal. He gave the order the next morning anyway, and it was, within the framework of the endurance doctrine, entirely reasonable. If the population wouldn't yield to the demonstration of Caldrith heat tolerance on its own, then a direct show of force at the block's central gathering point would settle the matter. The same tactic that had ended resistance cleanly on 4 prior worlds. He did not know, because nothing in the morning brief had flagged it, that the block's central gathering point that day was the annual back-to-school cookout Curtis Downey's Association threw every July, and that it sat directly beneath the stretch of Compton Boulevard, whose asphalt had spent 6 straight days baking under a heat advisory, radiating temperatures back into the evening air that made the block, by early afternoon, one of the hottest stretches of pavement in the entire city. Hot enough that Odell Marsh, working 2 doors down on a rooftop unit, had already told Mrs. Alvarez to keep her dog off the sidewalk before noon. The Caldrith show of force detail arrived at 2 in the afternoon, full environmental armor sealed, cooling reservoirs topped off that morning from a source Andre Suggs had not yet managed to shut down, and marched the length of the block at a deliberate, unhurried pace meant to be seen, which meant walking directly across the worst stretch of radiant asphalt on the entire street, at the single hottest hour of the day, for the length of time it took to make an impression. It made an impression, though not the one intended. Within minutes, the ambient heat coming off the pavement, heat their armor's cooling loops had never been calibrated against, because 81 prior worlds had never handed them a paved surface baked for a full week under a sustained heat advisory with nowhere for the heat to escape after dark, began outpacing what their reservoirs, already thinned from the previous day's disrupted water access, could manage. One soldier's cooling readout crossed into a warning threshold, then a second. The formation slowed, not from fear, but from the same practical, unglamorous physics that had been quietly running Compton's whole summer. Everything's got a breaking point once it gets hot enough, and asphalt that's baked for a week doesn't care whose doctrine says otherwise. At the same moment, right on schedule, the utility company's rolling blackout rotation reached that block again, cutting power for its usual 20-minute window, including the tapped line the Caldrith detail had been quietly relying on to keep a mobile cooling unit running behind their formation. The same tap Andre had flagged and never fully managed to shut off, now simply going dark on its own, the way the whole grid did, right on time, without anyone deciding to target anybody. 2 Caldrith soldiers went down where they stood, not injured, but overheated past the point their armor could self-correct, dropping to one knee in the middle of Compton Boulevard in front of a cookout that had, by that point, mostly just stopped to watch with the mild, unbothered curiosity of people who had seen plenty of things go sideways on a hot day, and generally figured it would sort itself out. It sorted itself out. Odell Marsh was the first one off the rooftop, tool bag still over his shoulder, moving toward the fallen soldiers with the same unhurried, practiced calm he brought to every call on his route, because to him a body in trouble in the heat was a body in trouble in the heat, whatever it was wearing. Get some water on them and get that plating off the back of the neck if it'll come off. That's where they're gonna lose heat fastest, he said, already working the seal on one soldier's collar the way he'd handle a stuck access panel, methodically, without panic. Curtis brought a cooler. Renata sent over a case of bagged ice without being asked. Andre Suggs, still technically off-duty, showed up with a hose from 3 doors down and ran it straight onto the pavement to knock the surface temperature back before anybody else went down. Even Pop Freeman rolled his box fan out to the curb on its extension cord and pointed it straight at the 2 soldiers, muttering that he'd told somebody they should have just sat a minute. Sorrent watched the feed from the command shuttle in total silence, long enough that Corette glanced over to check the connection hadn't dropped. What he was watching wasn't a battle. It was a street full of people who had never acknowledged his authority for a single hour of the occupation, working without orders, without hesitation, and without a shred of hostility, to save 2 of his own soldiers from a threat his doctrine had never once considered a threat at all. The ordinary, permanent, unglamorous heat of a city block that had been built, generation after generation, to survive exactly this. He opened a direct channel to the ground, and Odell was the one who picked it up, kneeling in the street with a hand still braced against a soldier's shoulder plate. This is Overmarshal V. Sarant, who is speaking. Odell Marsh, I fix AC units mostly. He didn't look up from the collar seal he was working loose. Your people are gonna be all right, long as we keep the water on 'em another few minutes. Whoever built this armor never planned for pavement doing what pavement does out here in July. That's not on them. That's just something nobody told them. You are aiding soldiers who came to secure your city. I'm aiding 2 people down on hot concrete, Odell said, plain, unbothered, the way the whole block had been unbothered since the hydrant got cracked open that morning. Don't much matter to me what uniform's on somebody when they're down like that. Matters that they get up. He finally glanced toward the comm unit clipped to the fallen soldier's shoulder. You keep looking for the one thing about this block that's gonna make everybody give up. Ain't one thing. It's all of it all the time, the ice, the hydrant, the paperwork, the rotation, folks just doing what they do whether you're here or not. You can survive our heat all day. Don't mean you can survive us just living our life around you. There was a long quiet on the line, long enough that somebody in the crowd finally cracked the joke that broke the tension. Something about the city finally getting the DWP to show up on time for once. And even Andre allowed himself a short, tired laugh over the hose nozzle. On the other end, faint through the comm, they heard the specific small sound of Sarant lowering himself into his command chair. Unhurried, the sound of a man setting something down that he had carried a long way. Sarant made his decision the way he'd made every decision across 81 campaigns. Deliberately, alone, before anyone on his staff could talk him out of it. He recalled the show of force detail, suspended all further contact operations on the block, and personally authorized medical extraction for his 2 downed soldiers under an improvised flag of cooperation that Curtis Downey's Block Association, with total seriousness, negotiated the exact terms of on Renata's front counter using the back of a raffle ticket pad. He filed a full report to Compact Command that would leave a single unresolved line on a record of 81 otherwise clean campaigns, and he filed it himself without being asked, because he had spent his whole career proving that the species who could stand the furnace already owned the field, and he had just watched a species who didn't need to stand the furnace at all, who had simply built a life that bent around it, block by ordinary block, refused to fold for a single hour. Ilya Korat drafted the doctrine revision that followed, the first in Kaldrith military history to include a formal category for what she termed, carefully, in the dry language of a report finally being read in full, sustained civilian infrastructure resilience under environmental duress. It took 3 days for the Kaldrith detail to fully withdraw from the block, and in all of it, the crashed drones, the hydrant standoff, the impounded water tap, the 2 soldiers down on the pavement, nobody on either side was seriously hurt, a fact Curtis Downey would go on repeating almost proudly to the local news crew that eventually showed up, to the county supervisor's office, and to a visibly overwhelmed federal liaison because to him that wasn't the footnote. That was the whole point. 2 weeks later at 6 in the morning, with the heat wave finally broken and the block back to its normal July rhythm, Odell Marsh climbed onto another rooftop off Willowbrook Avenue with a multimeter in one hand and his tool bag over his shoulder, because somebody's compressor was making a sound he didn't like. Sarant was gone. The soldiers were gone. The hydrant on the corner had been shut back down by the city, same as every summer, and Renata's generator sat quiet in the back of her store, waiting for the next heat advisory because there was always a next one. Everything's got a breaking point. Once it gets hot enough, Odell said, mostly to himself out of habit before he ever touched the wiring. Questions just where it is and whether you're ready for it. He found it, he fixed it, he always did. Compton never got a statue or a headline out of any of it, and most folks on the block figured that was about right, because the neighborhood hadn't won by outlasting anybody's furnace. It had won the same way it got through every summer. A hydrant cracked for the kids, a hose run down a hot street, a bag of ice sold for $2, a clipboard that wouldn't budge without the right paperwork, a fan pointed at a stranger without being asked, and a man who went straight to whoever was down in the heat without stopping to ask who they were first. That's the story. If you stuck with me all the way to the end, I appreciate you. Tell me in the comments. What's the one small thing your block does every summer without anybody organizing it that you think would end up mattering most on a day like this one?